Well, thank you to the Foresight Group and to the Eden Project for the kind invitation to speak to you all today. Next month will mark 48 months, a whole 4 years since the UK became the first G7 nation to place in law its net zero commitment. And I was the energy minister at the time, attending cabinet, who had the fortune of being able to take that legislation through the House of Commons. There's another individual in the room today, Lord Deben, who I worked closely with at the time in trying to ensure that the government would commit to net zero. We both recognised the CCC had 9 months beforehand recommended that the UK should raise its level of ambition to achieve net zero, and was able to do so on the back of the Climate Change Act passed in 2008. And it was passed at the time where the Conservatives were in opposition. Ed Miliband was the Environment and Climate Change Secretary, and the Conservatives' opposition actually pushed Labour to go further, to raise their ambition from 60% emissions reduction target on 1990 levels to 80% emissions reduction target levels. And I remember at the time thinking that when it came to tackling the climate crisis, we need to ensure that we have that political consensus, that delivering on what we need to achieve to reduce our emissions is too important for any one political party to take ownership of, attractive though that may seem. And I've always fought to try to demonstrate how we can build that consensus for the future. But that Climate Change Act was absolutely critical in not only establishing UK international leadership, but in seeding that political stability for the future. It created the Committee on Climate Change, which is not only internationally regarded, but nationally is supported by all mainstream political parties. And I remember working with Lord Deben, who came to me as Energy Minister, to try to make the case both to the Prime Minister, but also importantly to the Treasury. And I remember a meeting we had probably 4 years ago in May 2019, where we sat down with the then Chancellor, Philip Hammond, to try to make the case why net zero was an opportunity and not a cost, why the so-called headline figure of about between £1 and £2 trillion worth of the cost of the overall transition towards net zero by 2050 wasn't a cost that was going to necessarily be borne by the government or even by the private sector, but there was an opportunity to rethink through the lens of net zero and sustainability a new transformation towards a new economy for the future. At the time, the then Chancellor wasn't really sort of buying into the narrative that we suggested, and I can remember we ended up, and this is the reality and why I wanted to begin with this anecdote, around the compromises that sometimes you have to make in politics in order to push your own agenda forwards. And we had to take what was Carbon Budget 2 at the time, where the government, according to the sort of CCC's measurements, had sort of overshot the budget by, I think, 80 megatons of carbon. And the then Chancellor, Philip Hammond, said, I'm not signing net zero into law. I'm not going to allow you, give you cover from the Treasury, unless you move these 80 megatons of CO2 from Carbon Budget 2 to Carbon Budget 3. And I remember Lord Deben at the time saying, well, this isn't your carbon budget to have. The reason why you've overshot 80 megatons of carbon is because of the sort of economic slowdown in 2008. But the Chancellor was insistent. And at that time, a deal was struck by which the sort of this excess amount of CO2 that sort of the UK had overshot by was moved into Carbon Budget 3. But that was a compromise, the price of which was worth paying in order to get net zero on the statute books. If you'd asked me, however, sort of looking back 4 years from now, that 90% of the world's GDP would now be under some form of net zero target, I honestly simply wouldn't have believed you. What the UK managed to achieve at COP26 with the Glasgow Climate Pact was simply phenomenal. And the hard work that Alex Sharma, again, went going around the country, working country by country on raising their ambitions towards their national determined contributions for 2030. It demonstrated, again, UK climate leadership. But I'm not sure whether, if the UK hadn't led on net zero in the first place, we would have necessarily come out as being the most ambitious country when it came to a national determined contribution of 73% emissions reduction by 2030. But since the 4 years have passed, obviously the UK has continued to demonstrate that you can reduce your emissions by now over 50% on 1990 levels, and at the same time grow your economy, making the case that when it comes to net zero and decarbonisation, we can create successful forms of growth for the future. But fast forward 3 and a bit years, I was no longer in government, and I noticed there was a growing sense amongst some of my colleagues that sort of net zero was this sort of centralised sort of imposition, that somehow it was being sort of done to them. And I became sort of increasingly concerned that there was a populist attempt to move against net zero and sustainability. I think we've seen that mirrored also in the United States with attacks on ESG and potential related financial investment. So I took it upon myself to try to sort of think, well, what can we do to try to make sure that we can make the case for sustainability itself being sustainable? How can we put guardrails around some of these policies? It's important to recognise that while we reflect on the successes of the past, from where we've come from, of the progress that's been made, we can never let our guard down, and we constantly need to look to innovate, not just amongst the sort of technologies and the ecosystems of tomorrow, but also when it comes to policy innovations. We can't simply accept that net zero here today will survive for tomorrow. And what we need to do as a climate and sustainability community is continually work to reinvent ourselves, to refresh ourselves, to make sure our message is relevant to those who may wish to question it, who may wish to undermine it. We're seeing a new form of climate denialism emerge in the form of climate delayism. Those who claim that somehow net zero is going too far, too fast. Again, the same arguments emerging that somehow it's a cost to be born, that somehow it's going to make communities poorer and colder. We've all seen these tropes emerge and be amplified on social media. So I decided to set up something called the Net Zero Support Group, very much to sort of counter this organisation called the Net Zero Scrutiny Group that had emerged in the Conservative Party. As a result, I sort of somehow attracted additional attention to the fact that it should never have been the case, but the media were picking up on net zero and whether it should be seen as a cost. And I was determined to make the case for it being one of opportunity and one of economic growth. Then we had this sort of Conservative leadership contest, and again I was determined then to use the contest to ensure that no candidate took this opportunity to question our climate commitments, to somehow row back on the leadership that the UK had shown in the past. So myself and Alex Sharma sort of hosted a hustings of all leadership candidates. It happened to be on the hottest day of the year. You might remember there was actually fires taking place in the eastern corner of East London. I think it hit 104 degrees. It was particularly uncomfortable in the House of Commons. But I think it made some of those leadership candidates realise that this simply couldn't be a policy commitment they could ignore, no matter how tempting that might be for some of them, being pushed sort of rightwards by siren voices, again, claiming to go that net zero is too far, too fast. And we got this sort of Conservative climate commitment across the line. All candidates agreed. I won't go over the finer details of that leadership sort of contest, but as a result, the winning candidate, Liz Truss, asked me to look at how we could maybe do net zero in a more affordable and efficient way, in a way that was pro-business and pro-growth. Now, we all know that net zero is hugely an opportunity for delivering growth, a huge opportunity for business to be able to deliver new efficiencies, to be able to look at new ways of productivity. But politically, you can't take that for granted. Not everyone is reading, to the extent you all are in this room, the in-depth AR6 reports or sort of policy recommendations that come from the CCC, sadly. And that you have to take the political process a step backwards in the level you have to communicate with politicians, to the point that you're creating narratives. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, is that question about how we can create those new narratives for the future. Because policy frameworks are vitally important, but they'll only succeed if you can capture the imagination of those who you wish to ensure that those policy frameworks will be relevant and will benefit individual future lives. And trying to sell that message of hope, of opportunity, and sort of not casting the challenges we face around warming as one of crisis, I think is really important. So I was given this opportunity to independently chair what was then termed the Net Zero Review. I think at the time, when the review was established, there was a bit of alarm that individuals felt, oh, is the UK government somehow going to review net zero? Or is this mean that we're going to sort of see the policy end up again on the cutting room floor? And I was determined that that was never going to be the case. Obviously, to start with, I had to face the dreaded terms of reference that you have with any report, where you have to agree with the centre what the scope of the report was sort of going to cover. And I managed to sort of push back quite successfully to ensure that those terms of reference didn't cover areas that might sort of question the progress that had been made, not particularly in the private sector when it came to ESG legislation. But nevertheless, I was going to use this chance to see the review as a way of restating the case and reimagining net zero. As the minister that took forward that net zero legislation, the last thing I was determined to ensure was that somehow we were going to work backwards from that commitment. But equally, I felt that looking back 4 years ago, I was going to learn the lessons from the pace of change where we took that legislation through in the dying days of the May government. And I think it's always important that you have the humility to recognise as policymakers that you're not always right, that you do make mistakes. I think sometimes it's tempting that we sort of feel that we can't let our guard down sometimes when it comes to promoting sustainability, that somehow we are always the ones that know all the answers. And it's important to recognise that that won't always be the case. And thinking back on that time in June 2019, where we took the net zero legislation through the House of Commons, actually one of the mistakes that we made is that we didn't work hard enough to sell the benefits of net zero. We didn't have a cost-benefit analysis. There wasn't time, to be honest with you, to push that forwards. So we had net zero on the statute books without really working at that underpinning narrative of what net zero could mean for the future. So returning sort of 4 years on, I was determined to try to make that case for why net zero and sustainability isn't some kind of sort of green eco project, not to disparage the nature of sustainability, but to really centre the argument for sustainability within the economic case for why we need to deliver on a new economy for the future. I saw over the pond Joe Biden stating that every second new job was a green job and making the case for the transition, particularly in those hard-to-abate communities that were particularly concerned about what the transition might mean for them. That determination across the pond to demonstrate that when it came to future investment, this would mean growth, regeneration, jobs and investment. And how can we do the same in the UK and learn lessons from our international partners? So I was determined that when it came to the review, it simply wasn't a case of coming up with a list of policy recommendations. It also was a case of not always simply thinking that you're always right, that you are willing to reflect and where you took a wrong turning and how to restate the case better and learn from mistakes in the past. I've often reflected as a politician, you're bombarded with reports. Apologies for anyone who's written reports, but the challenge is how do you get that cut through? How do you ensure that the messages of a report will really capture the imagination of legislators for the future here to succeed? I look back at successful reports like the Stern Report or the Hills Review on Housing. I remember the Hills Review on Housing having that particular famous analogy of getting on the Jubilee line and sort of going 4 stops down, getting off at Stratford and finding that life expectancy had decreased by 13 years. And I think that was the first time that had ever been articulated. But really seeing policy frameworks, seeing statistics within that context of the human experience, the lived experience. And so when it came to the Net Zero Review, I had a fantastic team that was drawn across all departments, not just from the former Bays department that's now defunct. And I said to them all, as young civil servants, I want this to be something that you're proud of, that is going to be a line on your CV that you'll look back on and want to sell. And sometimes, for those of you who may have worked in government, sometimes you see government as a process rather than an outcome. And it's often, amongst all the attacks of civil servants, easy to forget that every civil servant is a determined human being who wants to succeed in their own individual lives, and making the case that they could be part of that sort of policy leadership story was really important. And I said to them, we needed a framework to start with on the Net Zero Review in order to have this narrative of how to focus on delivering on achieving sustainability for the future. So we created a sort of 6-pillar approach, and apologies for anyone who attended any of these evidence roundtables that we held. But what I wanted to say was that we're not going to review net zero, but how can we put guardrails around the policy? Because ultimately, net zero is not about 2050. It's about that national determined contribution of 73% emissions reduction I mentioned for 2030. And that's just less now than 80 months away, 79 months to be precise. I think it's quite helpful to think in months to really get people's imagination going. There was, when we published Net Zero Review, I think just 326 months until 2050. But that sort of 80-month time we have now, given we've just had 48 months since Net Zero was signed into law, really crystallizes the urgency of the situation we face ahead of us when it comes to looking at the challenges around net zero. And those challenges are what I wanted to focus on, not in a way of sort of saying it's impossible, that somehow we're not going to achieve it, but if we wish to make sure that we can achieve our ambitions for 2030, now whether that's on focusing on the net zero power grid by 2035, whether it's on focusing on the ZEV mandate for electric vehicles by 2030, or whether it's on focusing on the heat pump deployment target of 600,000 heat pumps by 2028. These commitments are just words on a page unless we are willing to set out the delivery pathways for how we are going to get there. And that requires us not just to look forwards, but to work backwards, to set out not just a programmatic long-term approach of how we're going to be able to deliver, to unlock the cost of capital investment, to de-risk private investment for the future, which can help bring down the cost of the transition in turn, but to work backwards in order to demonstrate that we have worked out where potential unknowable events and bumps in the road on the transition will occur. And that's something that's not happened yet for net zero. So if we want to make sustainability sustainable, we can't just will this change to happen. We can't just set out optimistically with a sense of where we potentially can be for the future. That's a road to disaster, because we need to be able, both in government and in the private sector, to demonstrate how we're going to be able to create future net zero markets, how we're going to be able to deploy at scale, and how we're going to be able to create that certainty of investment by understanding where those investment pathways can occur. And at the same time as taking forwards the Net Zero Review, the United States was working on their Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed during our consultation phase. So I was able to make this additional argument that where the UK once led on net zero, we are now beginning to slip behind internationally. There is a new net zero global race that is undeniable. But that net zero race where we're seeing people, individual countries pulling ahead of the United Kingdom is not just driven by enhanced sort of financial investment. It's driven by a recognition in those countries that we do need that long-term programmatic certainty for delivery. The IRA and their 45Q tax credits is guaranteed to the 1st of January 2033, and that's for projects that will still receive the tax credit for the life of the project, even if they begin on December the 28th, 2032. If you look at the EU, the EU Green Deal, Fit for 55, the Germany's 10-year hydrogen program worth 10 billion euros, or their sort of KfW scheme, again, a long-term commitment that provides the certainty for business to be able to invest in the transition, whether that's in hydrogen or whether that's in energy efficiency. So that was an overwhelming sort of case for the narrative around net zero, not just being the economic opportunity of this decade, an economic opportunity potentially of this century, with the potential for inward investment of up to £1 trillion by 2030, the potential to create 480,000 new additional jobs by 2035, I felt that was really important that we made that case that sort of net zero was not going to make us colder or poorer, was not some kind of sort of imposed sort of project on the United Kingdom. Actually, when it came to looking at sustainability and net zero, the government is now behind the curve. You have projects, and obviously Eden Projects has been pioneering, having been here now for nearly 25 years. But there are individual countless examples of communities around this country that want to go further and faster and are constantly being blocked by the centre, by Whitehall, by Westminster, by this government. That actually, there are community energy projects that have been waiting for years for the local electricity bill to be passed to give them the freedoms to be able to look at how we can innovate on the edge of the grid, to rethink how we create electricity for the future. When I meet with regional, mayoral, combined authorities or local authorities, they all want additional powers to be able to deliver on the net zero commitments that they have made, net zero commitments that go far beyond the government's 2050 targets. And yet we still see energy within the framework of a Cold War perspective, that energy somehow has to be a reserved power, that energy overall is somehow a critical national infrastructure that needs to be guarded carefully at the centre. And I fully understand that when it comes to grid and infrastructure and capacity and keeping the lights on, that we do need to guard and have that centralised approach. Indeed, we need to create new net zero grids that replace the old-fashioned national grid. And a huge challenge around how to build out that capability and capacity for the future. Tony Blair once said education, education, education was his priorities. Grid, grid, grid should be our priorities for the future. We have connection delays now spiralling into 2036. And what the Net Zero Review tried to set out was that while we have this enormous opportunity economically to succeed, to continue to lead, if we wish to take that net zero path, the alternative path, the not zero path, is one where actually it's not necessarily one where we have to take active decisions against net zero. The not zero path is simply maintaining the status quo and doing nothing. Just by standing still, we are missing out on those huge opportunities that not only now have the opportunity to go to other countries in a way they didn't before, but simply the lights will begin to go out on our existing grid. And this is where also we need to look at sustainability, moving away not just from its importance that it is grounded in nature and as an environmental imperative. It's not just an economic imperative, it's an imperative when it comes to energy security. Russia's illegal war in Ukraine and the costs of rising energy prices last year wasn't a cost of energy crisis, it was a cost of gas crisis. For too long, individuals have been able to get away with claiming that when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, that somehow that the intermittency of renewables is going to create a crisis down the tracks, that net zero is going to somehow leave us with the lights turned off. Actually, it's our continued dependence on gas and oil from foreign petrostates that is imperiling our continuity of energy supplies for the future. And we should never forget that we have to constantly make that case as well as the economic case. But the Net Zero Review set out very clearly as its priority these 6 pillars, as I mentioned. So the first one was securing net zero, and that was thinking through all those under-the-bonnet issues that I spoke about, working backwards on how do you develop a net zero technology roadmap, how do you develop a net zero investment plan for the future, how can we work out where we want the balance of our electricity supply, our energy supplies to be, how can we support our energy intensives, how can we build out sort of localized hubs for the future. Pillar 2 was powering net zero, again asking each sector in turn what do they need, not only to get the debris off the tracks, to unblock those barriers that are currently in the place of the future deployment of where they wish to achieve, but also where are their ambitions, if they were allowed to look up to the skies, where could they take their ambitions for the future? And we sort of set out in the Net Zero Review 10-year missions to come back to that sort of long-term programmatic approach where you can bring down the learning costs of the technologies, build out the supply chains, which after all lower the labour market costs, which is the highest part of the costs of the transition. And we had a rooftop revolution, a solar mission, where we believe we could achieve 70 gigawatts of solar power by 2035. There were missions on onshore wind, missions on grid and capacity, missions on having a local big bang to devolve those powers to local authorities and regional authorities that I mentioned about. I was glad that the circular economy was mentioned earlier, because that's another critical area where we need, certainly politically, to communicate better how sustainability and net zero is not just simply about emissions reduction. It's simply not about how we diversify our forms of energy supply and reduce energy demand, but how we reuse forms of energy for the future. How we can create an opportunity to demonstrate that we can have a future economy that is a regenerative economy, and understanding the opportunities for the circular economy, not just one that is one of economic growth with the potential for 400,000 extra new jobs for the future, but plays in also to that narrative around energy security. How can we base in this country an opportunity to look at processing plants, now whether that's for critical minerals such as lithium, whether that's for recycled sort of plastic, so we can end once and for all the farce that is that we're exporting recycled plastics to the South Asian countries that we see when we see sort of plastic bags from British supermarkets floating in the Pacific Oceans. But understanding that any waste that is lost is a lack of imagination in the opportunity to reuse, to recycle, and to ensure that we can make the most of every form of energy for the future. Also critical to net zero, to delivering on sustainability, is obviously biodiversity. And at the same time as taking the net zero review through the consultation process, we saw the CBD COP15 in Montreal come out now with new globally binding biodiversity targets. And I was keen in the net zero review to recognize the role that nature and land-based solutions plays in potentially achieving up to 40% of our emissions reduction. Yet actually, I think when it comes to looking at nature-based solutions, it really reflects back into the inadequacy that we currently see in central government. Lord Dearborn will know well, the one department that is furthest behind meeting its carbon reduction commitments is DEFRA. That actually we have no sense of leadership in that department on how they're going to achieve those CO2 reductions. But it's the small relation, poor relation, when it comes to all the other larger departments, and I'm not sort of making any excuses for it, but it obviously has other sort of priorities post-Brexit it's been sort of focusing on as well. But it goes to show the inadequacy of having these vertical departmental silos in government. So one of my wishes in the Net Zero Review, one of the 129 recommendations that I made as part of the report, was we create an Office of Net Zero Delivery. And that's not to obviously take away from the work that the CCC does, fantastic work in shining a light on what needs to be done, setting those ambitious and independent targets or a balanced pathway for the future. But if we're going to ensure that departments can meet those targets and that pathway, we need an organisation, a bit like the OBR, that is really able to force through that change that is needed. And we've seen the new government create the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, and in a way it's great. We again become the first G7 country to create a department with Net Zero in the title. But it's another one of those vertical silos. It doesn't have that horizontal opportunity to force through change. And I'm keen to make sure that when it comes to looking at net zero delivery for the future, we do continue to push for ensuring that departments are held to account at a more impartial level than they are currently, because we're simply just going to continue to fail. The Net Zero Review was published as Mission Zero, a 340-page report in January of this year. As I said, it set out 10-year missions for programmatic delivery for the future. I was keen to make sure that it was cross-party, so I spoke to all political parties. I worked closely with the Labour Party, Ed Miliband, Kerry McCarthy, Alan Whitehead, met with the SNP, met with the Welsh Government, because for myself, the template that review sets out could be adopted by any political party. And I think it's really important to remember, and I'll come on to discuss the current political situation in a moment, this current administration has, a year left of a legislative programme before potentially we go into a general election campaign that might end in October 2024. So there's limited time for this administration to act. Again, that's not to make excuses for them, but it's to recognise that we should all be thinking about the next general election now, be thinking about those future policy frameworks that we wish to push forward, recognising also the power of a manifesto is so important when it comes to delivery in government. I used to sit in the Cabinet Office, and I remember working with Jeremy Hayward on rag rating the government's manifesto commitments. You know, they are taken incredibly seriously at the centre of government. So this is an opportunity for us all to think how we can potentially get those commitments enshrined in a manifesto that whoever becomes the next administration comes 2024 will be thinking about how to deliver those, and they will be held accountable by Whitehall and the civil service. Because for myself, even though I'm not standing at the next general election, actually that 2024 general election is going to be critical for whoever's in government, because they'll be the government ultimately whose stewardship will see through the UK's government's commitment on the NDC for 2030 that I spoke about. It will be this government stewardship elected in 2024 that will see through the ZEV mandate or the heat pump target. So absolutely critical to ensuring that all political parties take through net zero at the forefront of their manifesto campaigns. We can't afford to let it slip. As I said, I couldn't afford to let it slip through the net when it came to the Conservative leadership contest, and I feel equally passionately that we've got to make sure that net zero doesn't fall by the wayside when it comes to other competing pressures around cost of living or NHS waiting lists. We've got to keep it at the top of the agenda. Now, in terms of this administration and the net zero review, I made 129 recommendations, as I stated. Of that, and as I come back to it, it was not just about the recommendations. I didn't want to, a shopping list. So thinking about that long-term narrative of those 10-year missions is absolutely critical. I will continue to push on that. But the government has agreed to take forward around about 70 of the recommendations. They've agreed in principle without a timeline to another 30 of those recommendations. And they rejected around 29 recommendations. Sadly, some of those included issues around a methane flaring ban for 2025, again, something the CCC and also the Environmental Audit Committee, on which I sit on, has also proposed. Rejections around potential hypothecated funds. So instead of having a windfall tax on oil and gas, how could we have created a net zero fund that could have been respent on net zero projects for the future? The Treasury is still not keen at the moment to think about that long-term investment vehicles. And I think that's something where we've got to continue to work together as a sustainability community to ask, what do we want? What are those long-term programs which we can work together on to come behind? Because the Treasury agreed to create £20 billion over 20 years for CCUS. They agreed to create Great British Nuclear as an investment vehicle for nuclear power. Now, if they can do that for CCUS, they can do that for nuclear, they can do it for renewables, they can do it elsewhere. And I'm keen that now we sort of think back into that net zero global race. We think what's coming ahead. We now know, we've got COP28, we've got COP20 in UAE, we've got COP29 in either Bulgaria or Czech Republic, we've got COP30 in Brazil, we've got potentially COP31 in Australia, and the Western and the Pacific Isles. So we've got the sort of pathway now of COPs sort of set out, where we pretty much for the first time know the host countries for the next 4 years. But within that international framework, where can we place the UK's future climate leadership, future leadership on sustainability? There's clearly a push by Jennifer Morgan and others for a renewable energy target to treble each individual country's provision of renewable energy by 2030. And I'm keen now to explore where we can take forwards additional policy frameworks within our net zero commitments. As I said, you can't just rest on your laurels. You've got to continue innovating and coming up with the new frameworks to be able to make the narratives afresh. So I think the renewable energy target is a really attractive one. And obviously the UK has a fantastic story to tell that we don't really tell internationally. We focused on net zero, we focused on our climate sort of commitments for the NDCs. But we have the largest wind farm in the world at the moment, although China is fast catching up. We have deployed renewables at scale. There were certain days in December last year where renewable energy made up nearly half of the electricity generation. Actually, it definitely was over half of the electricity generation for the United Kingdom. Where can we go further, faster, to be able to deliver on that? And obviously that requires us to unblock those barriers, those delays around grid, capacity, storage that I spoke about. But there is an opportunity in the present. There is now the Energy Security Bill going through the House of Commons. And I want to end on this before I open up to questions, because I see this as potentially now another opportunity politically, because you have to obviously, with the net zero and sustainability, think about sort of this twin track process. The innovations, the reforms we can make are only as good as the policy instruments and the tools we have at present. So one classic example being energy performance certificates, simply not fit for purpose, as the CCC will agree, when it comes to measuring carbon emissions reductions in the life cycle carbon content of buildings. But at the moment, it's all we have. So at the same time, we've got to make the commitments around EPC ratings in order to provide the certainty for the buildings industry to deliver on the here and now. But at the same time, we've got to continue the work to create new net zero building carbon standards, and then also ensure that the Future Homes Standard is delivered, and potentially that we go beyond the Future Homes Standard. In particular, making sure that solar panels should be a requirement on all new homes. Now, obviously, retrofit is absolutely critical to thinking about the 80% of buildings that already are going to be there by 2050. But the interesting question around the net zero building standard and putting mandatory solar on new rooftops is, I made that a recommendation in the net zero review. But the most sort of principled advocate for that wasn't many of the sort of NGOs and organizations who also sort of made the case. The person who came to me most passionately about that was actually someone called Craig McKinley, who's the chair of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, who I met with. And I got a bit of stick, I think, from the BBC, who wrote a story saying, just because I met with someone from the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, that I was going to somehow be meeting with the enemy. And this is another thing I think we've always got to think about when it comes to delivering on the future of sustainability, is that while we have to show humility and recognize potentially where we've taken wrong turnings to learn the lessons from where we have made mistakes in the past, at the same time we have to make sure that this narrative around sort of good versus bad, the morality tale that sometimes emerges on the transition, is put to one side, that we have to be able to work with those individuals, difficult it may seem sometimes, who do challenge the narrative around why we need to achieve net zero. Because unless we work with those communities that fear that they're going to be left behind, unless we can ensure that we can demonstrate face-to-face that actually their fears are misguided, that actually there is this opportunity to ensure that net zero won't leave us colder and poorer, it will leave us warmer and richer, and we continue to make that case, we're always going to have this false divide. So actually, I sat down with Craig McKinley and I said, well, what recommendations you would make, putting aside your own views on net zero, that you would like to see happen? And he said, actually, I think it's a disgrace that we have 1.4 million houses that have been built since 2010 that will now need to be retrofitted, and that the developers themselves should be paying for this. He saw this through the lens of the individual householder, the budget holder, the sort of versus the sort of larger corporates. But if individuals who are skeptical of net zero are able to still make the case for some of the policies that we agree on, let's find where we can agree. Let's make sure that we don't, when it comes to sustainability, leave certain individuals out of the room, and that we engage with them, because that is absolutely critical to maintaining those guardrails around the policy. There is a just transition that needs to happen in the UK as well as elsewhere in this world. The Net Zero Review was very clear that there will be households, regardless of the opportunities that renewable economics plays in ensuring there is a payback on insulation and adding solar panels to your roofs, or having an EV with a battery and reducing your costs, and some fantastic work on how to reframe net zero, not least by organisations like Octopus, which are now talking about net zero bill homes, again, making the economic case for sustainability and the transition. We can't rest on our laurels and thinking that we can deliver this transition just by ourselves. We need to make sure it's a whole of society transition. That's ensuring that every single community across the country has that opportunity to be involved. We won't be able to deliver net zero unless we take that place-based approach. So the Net Zero Review was very much a clarion call to move away from that top-down implementation of net zero recognizing that we need this big bang moment on sustainability. We can't just rely on everyone going cap in hand to the government and saying, this is what we need from you. We need to make sure that we have far more net zero authors who are willing to be masters of their own destiny, to be able to write their own net zero stories for the future. And how we empower those people and get government out of the way is equally as important as demonstrating the leadership that government needs to show for the future and providing the additional investment and the policy certainty and the long-term programmatic approach that I spoke on in order to deliver net zero. I'm not sure how long I've gone on for. I don't know if that's enough time, but happily take some questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Is that right time? Or? Oh, is it? Okay, cool.
Great, so we've got 5 minutes now to take questions. So if anyone in the room would like to ask Chris a question, we've got a roaming microphone. And anyone online, please use the Q&A box on the Zoom link, and I'll watch out for those coming through. We've got one over there.
Great, thank you very much. Just to kick questions off, my name's Kingsmill Bond from the Rocky Mountain Institute. And thank you very much for that absolutely brilliant summary, and you're a great hero of mine for what you've done. Thank you. So can I ask it's not a super soft question, but it's not terribly hard either. You talk about the necessity to work with everyone, but how about people who really want to maintain the fossil fuel system? I'm thinking people like organisations like the Global Warming Policy Foundation or Exxon, who really want to maintain the current system. I mean, what should we do with them?
So it's a really good question, and it's one which clearly when it comes to the transition, particularly around oil and gas, I've been very clear, trying to set the parameters for which you're willing to have those conversations is really important. I believe wholeheartedly, and I've come out publicly and said we should not have any new oil and gas. That's not to say that we have a transition to take forwards that recognises we'll still be using 60% of the oil and gas we are now in the 2050. And we recognise the industries which will be using that, the petrochemical industries. And this is why obviously focusing on the circular economy and the innovation that needs to happen around how we defossilise hydrocarbons for the future is the next stage of how we move away from the narrative that oil and gas plays into, which is that we'll never get off oil and gas. What I want with taking that conversation forwards is, again, to set ourselves that new end date goal, where we will make that commitment to no new oil and gas fields, but recognise that the existing ones will manage the transition and should be abating fully. There's no excuse why Norway has been sort of banning methane flaring since 1971, and we haven't done so ourselves. We look at sort of simply those industries can afford, of all industries, to make the transformations that they need to make. And I think also it's making the case that while we understand this is a transition away from oil and gas, there are no corners to hide. I think one of the things about net zero is when you had the 80% production emissions, everyone was able to say, we're the 20% of those emissions, we need to be counted in this 20% because it's just too difficult. And it's challenging ultimately that too difficult question. So net zero is 100% emissions reduction. Everyone has to take action. But ultimately, if we're asking every single sector to go net zero, if we're asking our car manufacturing sector not to sell any petrol cars by 2030, how can we look them in the face and say we're doing this where we're allowing a free pass for the oil and gas industry to 2050? And that's the challenge where I think quite reasonably you can sort of turn whatsaboutery on its head in the same way that climate deniers use whatsaboutery to talk about China and sort of say, well, actually, there is a case here that an exemption is being made that is unacceptable given every other industry is having to work hard to be able to deliver on net zero. And you've got the most investment opportunities of any community out there. So get on and demonstrate that you can put your money where your mouth is. And for these communities also to claim that they're net zero is also an abuse of the term. And that requires us to focus on really ensuring that we have the integrity of demonstrating, backed by the government, what is best in class, what is truly net zero, because we haven't done enough to demonstrate accurately as a government what is a authentic net zero transition as opposed to greenwash. And that's also really critical that we continue to have the transparency, which can lead to the greater accountability sort of for the future. But I do recognise that you do have to work with communities that represent a significant sort of local population in places like Aberdeen in order to make sure that the transition works for Aberdeen. We can't ignore them. But equally, being quite open and honest with other sectors that are looking to create new forms of fossil fuel extraction, that is the red line. That's why when it came to fracking, I nearly became an independent MP during the review when I refused to vote on a confidence vote on fracking, because if the former chief executive of Quadrilla can say that fracking is not going to work in the UK, if overwhelming evidence is that it's uneconomic as well as also being bad for our climate, then that's where we've got to be bold and say that this is a line where we're not willing to cross.
We've got two more over there.
Thank you. Andrew Swift from Fairer Science Limited in York, and thank you to the Minister for visiting York last year to hear about Bio-Yorkshire, you might remember. My question is about carbon capture and storage, and whether or not that's simply putting the problem off for another generation and not really tackling the issue, and whether or not the UK, in terms of food production, is making the most of recycling carbon dioxide into greenhouse and controlled growing environments for food production.
So just to ask, the second part of your question is around food recycling more generally, you said, or is it?
No, using carbon dioxide for the atmosphere inside the greenhouses to...
Oh, okay. So sort of...
rather than burying it in an empty reservoir under the North
So
Sea.
I think on that question, I mean, I'm quite interested in that opportunity for utilisation, which obviously has been a dirty word in the past. But is I think an important challenge, to recognise that for certain sites, there are energy intensives, there are industries that are never going to be able to decarbonise to the point of fully reducing their emissions. And obviously, what we need to make clear is that obviously electrification, digitisation of some of these industries, looking at sort of how we can modernise the equipment, can reduce at least 50% of the emissions. So sort of prioritise what we can do here and now, and we provide the investment, and we recognise a stable long-term pathway for energy intensives in industry. And that was a mission in the net zero review. I think it's important that there are certain specific hubs that we've seen with the clusters, Track 1, HyNets and Net Zero Teessides, Track 2, potentially the Acorn cluster and Viking in the Humber, that we can significantly reduce emissions in these hubs, and that support is provided. It can't be at the expense of obviously sort of focusing on compensating for continued emissions sort of production, and it's got to be also a commitment to a transition. So focusing, obviously, if they're going to look at be producing hydrogen, it'll start off with blue hydrogen. Where's their pathway to ensure there's going to be green hydrogen for the future? But when it comes to CCUS, obviously, absolutely, we should be focusing on the technologies we have here and now to continue to focus our progress on decarbonisation and reducing our emissions. At the same time, there is an opportunity for the UK to demonstrate international leadership on this. And this is going to happen, not maybe for 2050, but 2100 is, and there are going to be challenges around decarbonising and storage that we need to solve. The demonstrator projects, effectively what the clusters are, potentially, are world leading, can provide that opportunity. So, there is an important recognition of that place-based industrial cluster model that we need. The challenge is that there are plenty of dispersed sites for which that this sort of cluster approach isn't going to work. And at the moment, they've got nothing. And there's not the investment also that's taking place in the electrification or in the modernisation of the sites that needs to happen. And when I did the net zero review, went to places like Black Country or other areas where there's no geologic storage, they're saying, well, what's the government strategy? And there isn't a long-term pathway. And that's when I think potentially opportunities for utilisation in limited resource areas help those communities that are still going to produce emissions. So we should be focusing on decarbonising cement and concrete and steel and the innovation that needs to be prioritised there. But there is an opportunity to make the carbon price stack up with utilisation in specific circumstances. Obviously not extended oil recovery. That's the other one key thing where we can't let the oil and gas companies off the hook by simply thinking that they're going to somehow utilise CO2 for sort of effectively fracking more oil out of the ground. But there are other interesting examples where there's sort of production of sodium bicarbonate through utilising CO2 that actually is 22 times less carbon intensive than the original production of effectively virgin sodium bicarbonate. So there are individual sort of processes, and I think that but I think it's making sure that we set out the opportunities for utilisation, but equally you're aware that where is utilisation a clear pathway towards greater sort of success around delivering on climate change sort of challenges, as opposed to sort of just giving a free pass to the oil and gas industry to use utilisation for EOR.